The emergency signal started like whispers in the dark, then grew into screams that echoed across every corner of the galaxy. It wasn't just any message. This was the kind of transmission that made entire civilizations hold their breath. The Galactic Council, those ancient beings who had seen empires rise and fall like morning mist, were calling for help. And they never called for help. The ancient devourers were awake. Captain Jake Morrison had been enjoying one of those rare, quiet moments that spacers treasure. He was sitting in the observation deck of the UES Defiance, watching the stars drift by while nursing his third cup of coffee. The stuff was terrible, recycled water and synthetic beans, but it was hot and it was his. These small comforts mattered when you spent months at a time floating in the black between worlds. Then the communication array lit up like a Christmas tree, and everything changed. The message that came through wasn't the usual bureaucratic chatter from Earth Command or the trading updates from merchant guilds. This was different. This was terror wrapped in diplomatic language, desperation dressed up in formal protocols. The Galactic Council was trying to sound calm, but Jake had been in enough tight spots to recognize panic when he heard it. The Devourers, creatures that most species considered myths, stories told to scare children, had stirred from their million-year sleep. They were real, they were hungry, and they were already moving to the outer rim systems like a plague made of shadow and appetite. Across the galaxy, different species reacted in their own predictable ways. The Etherians, those floating jellyfish-like beings who prize peace above all else, immediately went into deep meditation. They believed that if they thought beautiful thoughts and sent out positive energy, somehow the universe would sort itself out. Jake had always liked the Etherians. They made excellent philosophers and terrible soldiers. The Synthoids, with their computer-like minds and perfect logic, ran the numbers. Their calculations were swift and merciless. Survival probability against the Devourers, less than 3%. Recommended action: immediate evacuation to the furthest edges of known space. Within hours, Synthoid colony ships were already preparing for the long journey to nowhere. The Klaxons retreated into their underground cities. The Zephyrs fled to their hidden dimensions. Even the proud Altarians, with their mighty battle fleets, took one look at the ancient records and decided that discretion was the better part of valor. But humans heard that transmission and reacted in a way that left the rest of the galaxy scratching their heads in confusion. Jake set down his coffee cup, the same cup he'd been drinking from for 2 years, with its chipped handle and faded Earth Command logo, and smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the kind of expression that his ex-wife used to call trouble looking for a place to happen. "All hands," he announced over the ship's communication system, his voice carrying to every corner of the Defiance. "We just got invited to a fight." The response was immediate. Throughout the ship, crew members stopped what they were doing. Lieutenant Amy Foster looked up from her sensor readings. Chief Engineer Bobby Chin paused in his eternal battle with the reactor coolant system. Even old Doc Williams in the medical bay perked up from his crossword puzzle. Because here's the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy had never quite figured out. They don't run from impossible odds. They run toward them. When you tell a human something can't be done, they hear it as a personal challenge. When you tell them something is going to destroy everything they care about, well, that's when they stop being civilized and start being creative. Within minutes of Jake's announcement, the Defiance was buzzing with activity. Navigation started plotting courses toward the last known Devourer sightings. Weapons specialists began checking and double-checking their systems. The communications officers started sending coded messages to other human vessels scattered across the sector. And Jake pulled up his personal files and started writing letters. The kind of letters that soldiers write when they're about to do something that probably won't end well. Letters to his sister back on Mars. Letters to his daughter at the Colonial Academy. Letters that might never be delivered, but needed to be written anyway. Meanwhile, light years away on Earth, Admiral Rebecca Hayes was having a very similar reaction in the war room of Earth Command. The holographic displays around her showed the locations of every human military vessel, every colony, every outpost. It wasn't much. Humanity was still the newcomers in galactic terms, still building their first tentative steps among the stars. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in attitude. The first reports came in like fragments of a nightmare. The Klaxon colonies in the Outer Rim had gone silent, not destroyed, not conquered, just gone. Where 3 thriving worlds had orbited their sun just days before, there was now nothing but empty space and the lingering taste of fear that even a vacuum couldn't wash away. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the briefing room aboard the U.S. Defiance, watching the holographic display with grim fascination. The Crystal Gardens, one of the galaxy's most beautiful sights, had been home to 17 million beings. Artists, philosophers, traders, families, an entire civilization that had spent centuries crafting floating cities of pure crystal that sang in harmony with solar winds. Now it was cosmic dust scattered across light years of empty space like the ashes of a funeral pyre. "They're not just destroying planets," reported Lieutenant Amy Foster, her voice steady despite the horror of what she was reading. "They're consuming them, converting the matter directly into energy. The energy readings we're picking up from these locations are off the charts. The Devourers weren't just weapons of war. They were cosmic locusts, stripping entire systems bare to fuel their advance. Every planet they touched, every moon they consumed, made them stronger and hungrier for the next meal. Across the galaxy, the response was swift and predictable. The Ethereum meditation fleets turned and fled toward the galactic core. The Synthoids had already calculated evacuation routes to the furthest edges of map space. The proud Altarian Empire, which had never retreated in 3,000 years of conquest, quietly began moving their capital ships away from the advancing threat. But in human space, something very different was happening. Admiral Rebecca Hayes stood in Earth Command's war room, surrounded by displays showing the location of every human vessel in known space. It was an impressive sight. Humanity had barely been spacefaring for 3 centuries, and their fleet was tiny compared to the ancient empires that dominated galactic politics. A few dozen heavy cruisers, maybe 100 smaller vessels, scattered across their small corner of the galaxy like seeds in a vast field. "Ma'am," called Commander Dave Mitchell from the communications station, "we're getting responses from every ship in the fleet. They're all reporting the same thing. Course laid in for the Devourer Advance, maximum speed." Hayes nodded grimly. She'd expected nothing less. When you told humans that something was coming to destroy everything they'd built, their first instinct wasn't to run. It was to grab the biggest stick they could find and meet the threat head-on. "Signal all vessels," she ordered. "Form up at Rally Point Zulu. We're going hunting." The Defiance was part of a small battle group that reached the outer edge of Devourer space first. Jake stood on his bridge, watching the sensor readings with the kind of focused intensity that came from years of deep space patrol. His crew moved around him with practiced efficiency. Amy at sensors, Chief Bobbychin monitoring the engines, Doc Williams ready with medical supplies they'd probably need soon. "Contact in 30 seconds, Amy called out, her voice cutting to the bridge's quiet tension. Jake looked at the tactical display and felt his stomach drop. The things appearing on their screens weren't ships in any sense that humans understood. They were massive organic creatures, each one the size of a small city. Their hulls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. Looking at them directly made his eyes water and his brain itch, as if his human mind wasn't designed to process what it was seeing. The Devourers moved through space with a fluid grace that no mechanical ship could match. They didn't fly so much as swim, cutting through the vacuum like predators through deep ocean water. And they were hungry. Jake could feel it somehow, a radiating sense of endless appetite that made his skin crawl. "All ships." Jake's voice cut through the calm chatter, steady despite the fear trying to claw its way up his throat. "Engage at will. Give them everything we've got." What happened next would be talked about in every corner of the galaxy for generations to come. For the first time since the Devourers had awakened from their ancient sleep, someone fought back. Not a strategic retreat, not a defensive holding action, but a straight-up, no-holds-barred attack run. The human ships opened fire with everything they had. Plasma cannons that could crack asteroids, missile salvos that lit up space like fireworks, rail guns that threw chunks of metal at significant fractions of light speed. It should have been like throwing pebbles at a mountain. But something incredible happened. One of the Devourer creatures actually staggered. Its bioluminescent patterns flickered and dimmed, For just a moment, the thing that had consumed entire worlds looked hurt. The cost was terrible. Half the human fleet was destroyed in the first exchange. Jake's ship limped back to base with hull breaches on 3 decks, life support failing, and 23 crew members who wouldn't be going home. The Defiance's medical bay looked like a battlefield hospital, with Doc Williams working frantically to keep the wounded alive. But as Jake sat in his damaged captain's chair, watching the tactical recordings of the battle, he smiled that dangerous smile again, because they'd proven something that would change everything. The Devourers could bleed. Commander Lisa Park had done a lot of crazy things in her 15 years of military service, but crawling to the guts of a living alien nightmare definitely topped the list. The maintenance shaft, if you could call the pulsing organic tunnel a maintenance shaft, was barely wide enough for her powered armor. Every surface around her team glowed with a sickly green light, and the walls themselves seemed to breathe. "This is seriously messed up," whispered Private Danny Rodriguez through the comm, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. The kid was fresh out of boot camp, and this was probably not what he'd signed up for when he joined the Colonial Marines. Lisa checked her heads-up display, watching the targeting system paint potential threats in the darkness ahead. The computer was having a hard time figuring out what to highlight. Everything in this place was technically alive. From the floor, they were crawling on to the ceiling that occasionally dripped something that definitely wasn't water. "Stay focused, people," she whispered back. "Remember, these things have ruled the galaxy for millions of years, but they've never faced boarding parties before. They don't know what we're capable of." The idea had come from Captain Jake Morrison himself, right after his battle group had limped back from their first encounter with the Devourers. Half dead and sitting in a hospital bed with 3 broken ribs, Jake had looked at the tactical data and asked a simple question. If these things are alive, why can't we board them like any other ship? The scientists had laughed. The admirals had called it suicide. The other galactic species had declared it impossible. But Admiral Hayes had looked at the casualty reports from conventional attacks and decided that impossible might be their only option. That's how Lisa found herself leading the first human boarding party in galactic history, crawling through what was essentially a living creature's digestive system with nothing but powered armor, explosive charges, and the kind of stubborn determination that had gotten humanity kicked off half the worlds they tried to colonize. Movement ahead, called Sergeant Tom Bradley from point position. Tom was a 20-year veteran who'd seen action on 3 different worlds, and he had the kind of steady nerves that made him perfect for this kind of insane mission. "Looks like some kind of immune response. Things are getting squirmy." Lisa crawled forward to take a look. The tunnel ahead was filled with what looked like floating jellyfish made of liquid metal, drifting through the organic corridors like antibodies in a bloodstream. They pulsed with the same bioluminescent patterns as the ship's exterior, and just looking at them made her vision swim. "Okay, people, this is where it gets interesting," she announced to her squad. "These are probably the ship's white blood cells, so to speak. They're going to try to neutralize us like any other infection. But here's the thing. We're not just any infection. We're humans, and we don't go down easy." The team moved forward with the kind of controlled aggression that human soldiers had perfected over centuries of warfare. They didn't fight like the elegant Altarians with their precise formations, or the savage Korth with their berserker charges. Humans fought dirty, fought smart, and fought with the kind of creative violence that came from evolving on a world where everything was trying to kill them. They used the ship's own biology against it. When the immune responses tried to surround them, they activated chemical flares that confused the creature's senses. When the walls started closing in to crush them, they used plasma cutters to carve new paths. When strange organic growths tried to entangle them, they deployed acid charges that burned to the living tissue like it was paper. "Found something big." Tom's voice crackled to the comm from up ahead. "Commander, you need to see this." Lisa worked her way forward through the increasingly hostile environment, dodging floating antibodies and stepping over patches of what looked like neural tissue. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, and what she saw there made her stop dead in her tracks. It was a brain, not like any human brain, but definitely a brain, a massive, pulsing organ the size of a city block, covered in millions of neural pathways that sparked with electrical activity. The whole thing looked like angry spaghetti that someone had wired up to a power plant. Well, She said after a moment of stunned silence. That explains how these things coordinate their attacks. This is their command center. Want me to light it up, Commander? Tom asked, his hand already reaching for the demolition charges on his belt. Lisa smiled inside her helmet. This was why humans were dangerous. They didn't just fight, they learned. Every battle, every encounter, every small victory taught them something new about their enemies. The Devourers had spent millions of years being the ultimate predators, but they'd never faced prey that studied them back. Light it up, she confirmed. The explosion that followed was beautiful in its simplicity. 20 pounds of military-grade explosives, delivered right to the nerve center of a creature that had never experienced pain before. The blast rippled through the organic corridors like shock waves through water, and for the first time in its ancient existence, a Devourer's ship writhed in agony. The bioluminescent patterns that covered its hull flickered and dimmed. Its movement through space became erratic, confused. Other Devourer ships in the area actually backed away from it, as if they couldn't understand what was happening to their companion. Lisa and her team fought their way back to the extraction point, dealing with increasingly desperate immune responses as a dying ship tried to purge the infection that was killing it from within. They made it out with 30 seconds to spare before the creature's death throes would have crushed them. Back on Earth, the scientists were going crazy with excitement. Every piece of data that Lisa's team transmitted, every scan they took, every sample they collected, added to humanity's growing understanding of their enemy. The Devourers weren't gods or demons or unstoppable forces of nature. They were just very successful predators who had gotten comfortable at the top of the food chain. They'd grown lazy, predictable, overconfident in their dominance. But evolution was about to teach them a harsh lesson. They'd awaken in a galaxy that now contained humans, and humans were about to show them what happened when apex predators met something even more dangerous. Intelligent persistence hunters who refused to give up. The galaxy's most ancient nightmare was about to discover why humans were called Deathworlders. The war room at Earth Command had become the beating heart of humanity's desperate fight for survival. Admiral Rebecca Hayes stood before a massive holographic display that showed the current state of the galaxy, and it wasn't pretty. Red zones marked Devourer-controlled space, slowly creeping inward like a cancer. Blue zones showed the dwindling territories of the various galactic species, and the tiny green dots scattered throughout represented human forces, vastly outnumbered but refusing to give ground. Hayes had been awake for 36 hours straight, surviving on coffee and pure, stubborn determination. Her uniform was wrinkled, her gray hair was falling out of its regulation bun, and she had the kind of exhausted look that came from making life-and-death decisions every few minutes. But her eyes were still sharp, still calculating, still looking for any advantage she could find. Status report. She called a room full of officers who had become her extended family over the past weeks of warfare. Colonel Dave Mitchell looked up from his datapad, his expression grim. The good news is we're not alone anymore, Admiral. The Court have thrown in with us. Apparently they see this as the ultimate hunt. They're bringing 50 heavy battleships and about 10,000 of their best warriors. The Court were a species that most civilized worlds preferred to avoid. They were massive, furry beings who had built their entire culture around combat and honor. Where humans had learned to fight because their homeworld was trying to kill them, the Court fought because they genuinely enjoyed it. They were natural allies in a war like this. The Razak are also with us, Mitchell continued. They lost their homeworld to the Devourers about a century ago during the Last Awakening. They've been waiting for revenge ever since. The Razak were different, sleek, reptilian beings who had survived the previous Devourer outbreak by hiding in deep space. They understood these creatures better than anyone else alive, and their hatred ran deeper than ocean trenches. They brought advanced technology and tactical knowledge that humanity desperately needed. That's the good news, said Major Kelly Stone, stepping forward her own report. The bad news is that our other potential allies are having philosophical difficulties with our methods. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Explain. The Ethereans refuse to use the pain inductor weapons we developed, Kelly said, pulling up tactical data on her tablet. They say it's inhumane to cause deliberate suffering, even to something that's trying to eat them. They want to find a peaceful solution that doesn't involve what they call torture devices. Hayes rubbed her temples. The pain inductors have been one of humanity's most effective weapons against the Devourers, devices that could overload the creatures' nervous systems and cause them to retreat in agony. But the Etherians, with their philosophy of universal compassion, couldn't bring themselves to use them. The synthoids are another problem, Kelly continued. They won't employ our chaos tactics because the randomness interferes with their processing systems. They keep trying to find logical, predictable patterns in our strategies, and when they can't, they just shut down. This was the fundamental problem that humanity kept running into. The chaos tactics that made human forces so effective, the unpredictable attacks, the improvised strategies, the willingness to try completely insane plans, were exactly the things that other species couldn't handle. Humans had learned to embrace chaos because they'd grown up in it. Other species had evolved beyond such messy, violent solutions. The holographic display flickered, and Commander Ben Carter's face appeared via long-range communication from the front lines. The left side of his face was covered in medical gel, and his uniform was scorched from recent combat. He'd taken over Jake Morrison's position after Jake's ship had been destroyed in the Battle of the Seventh Ring. Though Jake had managed to survive and was currently recovering in a hospital on New Geneva. Admiral. Ben's voice crackled through the communication array, distorted by the interference from nearby Devourer ships. We're pushing them back, but barely. Every victory costs us ships we can't afford to lose. Hayes studied the tactical data streaming in from Ben's position. Human forces had managed to halt the Devourer advance, and even push them back in several sectors, but at a terrible cost. They were winning battles, but losing the war through simple attrition. We need something big, Admiral. Ben continued, his image flickering as his ship maneuvered to avoid enemy fire. Something that'll end this before we run out of ships and people. We can't keep trading one for one with these things. They got millions of years' worth of reinforcements, and we got maybe 6 months of reserves left. Hayes nodded grimly. She'd been doing the math herself, and the numbers weren't encouraging. Humanity had managed to surprise the Devourers with their ferocity and creativity. But surprise only worked once. The ancient creatures were adapting to human tactics, learning to counter their strategies. Soon, the element of surprise would be gone, and humanity would be left with nothing but determination and stubbornness. She stared at the tactical display, watching the slow retreat of Devourer forces. The creatures were pulling back, but not in defeat. They were regrouping, consolidating their forces for a final push that would sweep humanity aside like dust in the wind. That's when the idea hit her. Terrible, desperate, and completely insane. Exactly the kind of plan that only humans would consider. She thought about humanity's greatest strength, their willingness to sacrifice everything for the people they cared about. Other species fought to preserve themselves, to maintain their way of life, to protect their territories. Humans fought for something different. They fought for the idea that some things were more important than survival itself. I need you to pull back to Rally Point Delta, she told Ben, her mind racing as the plan took shape. All human forces, full retreat to Delta. Ben's scarred face showed confusion. Admiral, if we retreat now, they'll overrun the civilian colonies. Millions of people will die. Trust me, Commander, Hayes said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people follow orders even when they didn't understand them. I'm about to show the galaxy why they call us crazy. As the communication ended, Hayes turned to her staff with a smile that would have made Jake Morrison proud. The kind of expression that usually meant someone was about to do something extraordinarily dangerous for all the right reasons. The plan forming in her mind was vintage humanity, noble, suicidal, and just crazy enough to work. The final battle began at a place that defied description. The Devourer's awakening site wasn't a planet or a space station. It was something far more ancient and terrifying. Imagine a structure the size of a small moon, but made entirely of living tissue that pulsed with its own malevolent heartbeat. It floated at the center of the Devourer swarm like a diseased star, radiating waves of hunger and intelligence that made human sensors scream warnings across every frequency. Admiral Rebecca Hayes stood on the bridge of the U.S. Defiant, looking out at what remained of humanity's space fleet. It wasn't much to look at, maybe 60 ships in total, ranging from heavy cruisers to converted cargo haulers that desperate volunteers had fitted with weapons. Every vessel bore the scars of weeks of brutal combat. Hull patches covered meteor impacts, Hasty repairs showed where Devourer bioweapons had tried to eat through their armor, and the flickering lights visible through their viewports told the story of ships pushed far beyond their design limits. But they were here. Every last human ship in the galaxy had answered the call, their crews knowing full well that this was a one-way trip. These weren't professional soldiers anymore. They were volunteers, merchants, colonists, even teenagers who had lied about their age to join the final mission. They came because someone had to, and because running was never really an option for their species. All ships. This is Admiral Hayes, she announced over the fleet-wide communication channel. Her voice carried to every bridge, every engine room, every gun turret where humans waited for the order that would end everything. Today, we show the galaxy why the call went out to everyone, but only we took it personally. On the bridge of the UES Retribution, Commander Ben Carter listened to those words while running final checks on his ship systems. His face still bore the scars from his last encounter with a Devourer bioship, and his left arm was in a regeneration cast that wouldn't be ready for another 3 weeks. Not that it mattered now. 3 weeks might as well have been 3 centuries. Primary charges armed and ready. Admiral, Ben reported, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. Every human ship had been loaded with antimatter charges, turning them into the largest collection of bombs in galactic history. It's been an honor serving with you. Hayes felt her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't afford to show. Ben was barely 25 years old, fresh out of the academy when this war started. He should have had decades ahead of him. Maybe a family, certainly a career that didn't end in a suicide mission against impossible odds. The honor was mine, Ben, she replied. All ships into the beast. What happened next would be remembered and retold across the galaxy for as long as civilizations existed to tell stories. The human fleet didn't try to fight their way through the Devourer swarm that surrounded the Central Intelligence. Instead, they did something that no sane species would ever consider. They let themselves be captured. The Devourers had a feeding mechanism that worked like a gravitational tractor beam, pulling prey into their digestive systems to be broken down and absorbed. It was how they had consumed entire planets, how they had turned the matter of whole star systems into fuel for their expansion. No species had ever survived being pulled into those organic maws. But no species had ever tried to turn the process into a weapon delivery system. The human ships rode the pulling force like surfers riding a tsunami, their engines screaming as they accelerated directly toward a thing that had haunted galactic nightmares for millions of years. They fired their weapons as they went, not to destroy the creature, but to punch holes in its defenses, to create the perfect entry points for what came next. Across the galaxy, every species with the technology to monitor deep space watched in horrified fascination as humanity committed what could only be described as the ultimate act of spite. The Etherians wept for the sacrifice. The Synthoids calculated the probability of success as approaching 0. The Korth howled battle songs that praised the courage of their human allies. And then the first ship reached its target. Commander Ben Carter had just enough time to send one final message before his ship disappeared into the creature's central processing core. "Tell them we were here," he transmitted. "Tell them we didn't go quietly." The cascade explosion that followed lit up half the sector. 60 ships' worth of antimatter charges, detonated simultaneously inside the living brain that had coordinated the Devourers for eons. The explosion was visible from 3 star systems away, a brilliant flash that turned the darkness of space into temporary day. When the light faded and the radiation cleared enough for sensors to function again, something incredible had happened. The Devourer swarm, millions of creatures that had moved with perfect coordination for countless ages, simply stopped. They drifted through space like ships without crews, their bioluminescent patterns flickering and dying as their central intelligence was reduced to scattered atoms. Without their guiding intelligence, the individual Devourers became nothing more than confused animals, lost in the vastness of space. Some simply shut down and died. Others began attacking each other, their primitive instincts taking over now that higher coordination was gone. Within days, the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known was reduced to scattered, dying creatures that posed no more danger than any other space-borne predator. The galaxy was saved. Humanity was gone. In the aftermath, As the various species emerged from their hiding places and began to rebuild, they struggled to understand what they had witnessed. The Galactic Council commissioned artists, historians, and philosophers to create memorials to the species that had saved them all. But in the end, they settled on something simple. At the coordinates where humanity had made its final stand, they erected a monument visible from hyperspace, a beacon that would shine for 1,000,000 years, ensuring that no one would ever forget what happened here. The inscription was carved in every major galactic language, but the message was simple. They took it personally. Because that's what humans did. When you threatened everything they cared about, their families, their friends, their ridiculous dream of exploring the stars, they didn't just fight back. They made it personal. And when humans took something personally, they were willing to pay any price to make sure the threat never returned. The galaxy learned that day why humans were called Deathworlders. Not because they came from a dangerous planet, but because they were willing to become dangerous themselves when everything they loved was on the line.